From 1910 to 1920, Mexico endured the Mexican Revolution, which was the first revolution in Latin America against a dictatorial and unjust governmental power, and social changes that led to major and minor relations between Mexico and the United States of America, such as the Great Migration and economic status. This proved itself to be a turning point of the 20th century for both growing countries. It all started in the re-election of Porfirio Diaz, a former general and leader against the French intervention in the 1870s, in 1910 against his political opponent, Francisco Madero. Porfirio Diaz was credited for being inspiration to the Mexican population for his previous battles as a volunteer fighter and a high-ranking soldier for the Reform War and French intervention in the 19th century, but his opponent, Francisco Madero, was noted for bringing a more democratic approach to Mexico. The election was in Diaz's favor, for it was rigged and Madero was sent to prison by Diaz's word. Madero fled to the States after being released and went on to build an army from his plan he called the Plan of San Luis Potosi. After constant fighting and help from Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, he had been elected president. This sparked more political groups, social and conservative, to form under the impression that whoever was in charge would fall because of their way of running Mexico. While Madero was president, he didn't give credit to Zapata and Villa, which frustrated them into starting their own revolutionary groups to take down Madero. From 1910 to 1920, leaders and generals such as Huerta, Carranza, the infamous Pancho Villa, and the also more modern inspirational leader Emiliano Zapata would fight each other in order to control Mexico, all for their own causes. After Madero was taken down from presidency, Huerta became the new president. Soon Huerta was taken down by Pancho Villa and Carranza. Carranza became the new president that everyone had come to agree with for a short time. Carranza was then opposed by Villa and Zapata and had to fight battles against them. He had on his side Obregon, a famous general leader at the time, who would later on become the president of Mexico. The Mexican Revolution proved itself to be a turning point for the Mexican people, on the terms that local peasants, otherwise known as Campensinos, were usually men, women, and children who had fought in the war. And by the end of it all, over 1 million people had died, and over 300,000 people had died of the flu epidemic in the 10-year span of fighting. The men in the war who fought the current government lived by the code that Emiliano Zapata had once declared: "It is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." After this, agriculture was even more destroyed than what it originally was 10 years ago. The economy was destroyed due to the lack of railroads and factories that were destroyed in the war, and mass immigration began to excel up north. Women from indigenous parts of Mexico had begun to get a title in the revolution. Women of the Mexican Revolution were named solteras. Dolores Jimenez y Muro was a key influencer in the social views in the revolution. She was a school teacher born in Aguascalientes, Mexico, and was a follower of Zapata. Jimenez was part of a group named La Mujer Mexicana. It was a group that formed the ideas for a plan to create a rebellion in order to bring Madero to power by taking down Porfirio Diaz during his presidency. This in which impressed Zapata to take her in as a political advocate after Madero was sentenced into power. Jimenez's influence in the documented political and social plan was clear because of the reform to decentralize the Mexican educational system. Jimenez y Muro created the Regeneración y Concordia. This was a group for Muro to influence women not only to fight in the revolution, but to make it a lifestyle for their children and for themselves. Another important figure of the Mexican Revolution was Ermila Galindo. She was a key woman in the political side of the revolution. She was a public advocate of the revolutionary Carranza and was the editor of the feminist journal Mujer Moderna. One important figure of the Mexican Revolution was Emiliano Zapata, who was from the southern state of Morelos of Mexico and of indigenous and Spanish descent. His main goal was to commit Mexico to having better treatment for the indigenous tribes of the country. Even though he had not performed his wishes during his self-declared presidency, Zapata had a legacy that had followed after his death almost 75 years later with a new political social group called the Zapatistas, formed by many of the Campensinos of indigenous descent of the southern part of Mexico, such as the state of Chiapas. The social changes of the revolution impacted mainly women, children, and unjust treatment of indigenous tribes since the revolution itself, to the legacy of its importance in close to modern times, such as 1994 in the formation of the Zapatistas, with Subcomandante Marcos, another man from indigenous tribes of Mexico. In the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican economy was also struggling with the mass immigration of the Mexican population towards the United States. Ever since railroads had been built in northern Mexico, there had been immigration for American jobs, which was a big motive for the Mexican population in northern Mexico all around. Mainly it was the men who had gone to work and also men with higher governmental powers meeting with the U.S. companies. During and after the Mexican Revolution, immigration began to increase among the population not wanting to fight or participate with the revolution at the time. With many people leaving Mexico, and many people either dying of the fighting of the revolution or the flu epidemic going around the world at the time, Mexico's economy had slowly derailed itself to a poor state due to the lack of one main type of transportation method and production method, which were railroads and factories. Existing railroads were mainly used for the government's participation in the Revolutionary War, being as a transportation system for soldiers, and factories were used to produce steel for guns, cars, and carts for the soldiers working for the Mexican government at the time. There was also the agriculture industry struggling due to the fighting in small villages and towns all over Mexico. With that said, people all over Mexico began to move north for the search for jobs, and this movement had been a political and social issue in the States ever since the Mexican Revolution had even ended. Also, the car industry beginning to pick up in the mid-1920s was a motive for not just Mexican, but Latin American immigrants to seek jobs up north. There was a need for work in the agricultural field in the United States, calling for migrant workers to work for free and cheap, under certain restrictions that were unfair or not legal. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, there had been movements among the newly arrived immigrant workers or United States citizens of Chicano heritage that opposed mistreatment against their migrant workers, or just workers in the agricultural field. There was acts towards regulation for immigration ever since the late 18th century, such as the Naturalization Acts, which stated that citizenship may only be issued to citizens if they have some sort of residency paper or documents. The fear of undocumented immigrants and workers had been an issue in the United States throughout the past century, due to many reasons concerning espionage, terrorism, overgrowth population, and transportation of illegal drugs. With many other acts being made on immigration in the United States, regulation had begun to become stricter and tighter to get around for the Mexicans trying to immigrate, or even Latin Americans from all over. Even in modern times, the United States and Mexican relations have been tested with more modern acts towards immigration. For example, the Real ID Act, issued during George W. Bush's term, required all previous immigrants to have documents saying they were United States residents. And if an immigrant or migrant worker of Mexican heritage did not have their documentation, they were to be deported back to their homeland in Mexico. This was an issue to the Mexican population trying to immigrate towards the north due to the fact the United States government had put a guarded fence on the border. Immigrants had found new ways of crossing the border through water transportation or makeshift tunnel systems. However, these acts were also made to protect the United States from the war on drugs. The war on drugs being known to be against Mexican cartels or any other Latin American cartels smuggling drugs across the border to the United States or even to Canada, which had become another issue for the act to face. During and after the revolution, immigration managed to make a trademark name for itself as a problem of the 20th century for the United States of America and for Mexico itself. Whether it meant the gaining or decline of economic status, population, or both countries' moral, cultural, and social beliefs and growth. Ultimately, throughout and after the revolution, Mexico had changed due to the loss of citizens of low to middle class stature from the immigration up north to the United States, creating mixed relations between both countries, the social and cultural changes that came within each part of Mexico, and the unforgettable revolution remembered by every person's elder that participated in it. These reasons are what make the Mexican Revolution one of the most important turning points of the 20th century.